NAACP Boston head Tanisha Sullivan. She threw her hat in the ring for Secretary of the Commonwealth with one issue driving her in particular, as she told Jim Braude on Greater Boston, an issue that's also been getting a lot of national attention in recent days: expanded voting rights.
We have an idea that here in Massachusetts, everything is okay. And the reality is we are actually behind other states. So first and foremost, we got to catch up.
But if anything, right now, Massachusetts seems to be moving in the opposite direction, with popular provisions for mail-in voting and expanded early voting that were implemented during the pandemic expiring a few weeks ago, despite repeated pleas from current Secretary of State Bill Galvin to make them permanent. So right now, how does Massachusetts stack up to the rest of the country when it comes to voting rights, and why aren't we doing more? I'm joined by State Representative Erika Uyterhoeven of Somerville and Cheryl Crawford, Executive Director of MassVOTE, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that aims to increase voter participation. Thank you both for being here. Cheryl, let me start with you. How does Massachusetts compare, in your estimation, to other states? Are we top tier, somewhere in the middle, lagging the majority of states?
Yes, so in my opinion, we are in the middle tier. You know, of course, we're nothing like Texas or Georgia, but we're lacking some serious reforms here, such as same-day registration and permanent mail-in voting. I mean, that would place us at the top. We have so much to be proud of and much to thank our policymakers for. You know, the state has passed a broad law back in 2014 that really introduced reforms like online voter registration and 16 and 17-year-olds. But serious work still remains, you know, for our top, you know, to put us at the top of the pack. And one way to do that would seriously be to pass the VOTES Act, which is under consideration in the State House as we speak in the Ways and Means Committee. So
I want to ask you about the VOTES Act, but before I do that, you mentioned 16 and 17-year-olds, and I want to make sure I know what you're talking about there. What are you talking about there?
So we passed a law back in 2014 that would allow us to register 16 and 17-year-olds while they're still in high school. They would not be able to vote until they turn 18, but they could register. So
one more question for you, and then I'll bring Erika in here. Cheryl Crawford, what's your assessment of why the legislature did not act to codify those pandemic-era reforms that I mentioned a moment ago? Why didn't they get that done?
You know, well, while we really wish that they had passed it back then, the VOTES Act last year, we understand that the legislature had a lot on their plate last year. They had, you know, they were dealing with the COVID pandemic. They were also deciding on how to spend federal funds and relief funds and all of that kind of stuff. But what we do recognize is that the legislatures disagree on what voting reforms should look like in Massachusetts. One sticking point is the same-day registration. You know, we've been looking to pass that for over a decade. And so convincing legislators is still our main priority this year.
Erika Uyterhoeven, from your perspective inside the building as a member of the legislature, are you as charitable in your assessment of the legislature not codifying the pandemic reforms that we mentioned as Cheryl is, or are you a harsher judge of that not getting done before they lapsed?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I agree with Cheryl, but I will add that, you know, one of the biggest hurdles, particularly in the House, because I do want to point out that the state Senate did pass the VOTES Act 36-3, so overwhelmingly down party lines. And in the House, we have 80% held by Democrats, right? So we have a very big margin to be able to pass these voting reforms. But I think Cheryl's absolutely right that there is a struggle, particularly with same-day voter registration, as well as the biggest hurdle, particularly on the House side, is inaction and maintaining the status quo. Last year, we passed bills on gambling regulation. We passed bills on pen cage size regulation, but we didn't pass voting rights. And I want to state that, you know, this is the underlying issue is around accountability in the legislature, and that inaction right now is absolutely unacceptable. Inaction means keeping in place Jim Crow era voting laws, which is what same-day registration is trying to fix. You know, inaction means we lawmakers are consenting to keeping in place laws created by the white supremacist backlash to Reconstruction. So passing the VOTES Act and dismantling arbitrary barriers to voting is absolutely a moral imperative that we owe it to our voters, our communities of color, and to anyone who has been put on the margin by these systems. And it's our commitment to build a vibrant democracy to ensure that this happens.
To what extent might some reluctance on the part of your colleagues stem from the fact that the status quo is working pretty well for them right now? And if you expand the electorate, maybe their jobs are not as secure as they have been. Is that part of it?
I can't say as to why the reasoning is, but I will say that it is absolutely important that we expand the electorate, right? We know that across the board that we have a commitment to do that. And that, I'll say particularly myself as representing one of the younger districts in the Commonwealth, that it's just such an important piece that we get young people, people of color, and removing these barriers from them to vote I would say supersedes, right, any sort of argument around the need to maintain the status quo, that this is something that our country is in deep need right now. And as we're struggling with what is democracy and protecting our democracy, now is the time for us to act.
Cheryl Crawford, do you sense any increased appetite in the legislature for acting on some of the ideas that we've talked about here, and maybe some other ones? I know that MassVOTE has backed the FAIRS Act, which would make public transportation free on Election Day. Is there any increased appetite, given that we see some states moving in the opposite direction? And in Washington right now, we saw Democrats try and fail to move forward national voting rights legislation. Before you answer, let's take a look at Chuck Schumer waxing morose as that effort failed.
Throughout our nation's history, moments of significant progress have often been followed by reactionary backlash. Unfortunately, it seems, led by one party, compelled by the most dishonest president in our history, we are in another of those dark periods.
So Cheryl Crawford, are you sensing any increased interest in being more proactive and aggressive when it comes to voting rights in the legislature right now?
Actually, I'm not, because if I felt it, then they would pass the Votes Act, right? Because that is a no-brainer. That's a bill that would just, they didn't act on the federal level. We have a great opportunity to act on the state level. Passing the Votes Act would absolutely do that. I mean, I don't know if they have a greater appetite to pass it, but I know according to the December 2021 poll conducted by UMass Amherst, in WCVB, nearly 2/3 of Massachusetts voters support SDR. Like, people have already spoken and said, we want to do this. There are many great reasons why we should pass same-day registration, and that seems to be the one glitch. I don't know if the representative agrees with me or not, but that just seems to be the one sticking point in passing this piece of legislation. And quite frankly, that will just catapult us into the new century. We're in the middle. We're supposed to be on the cutting edge, and we're not.
Erika Uyterhoeven, is that the big hang-up, as Cheryl Crawford says? And I should note here, by the way, we've talked about reforms that were put in place during the pandemic. Same-day registration is not one of them. That being said, is that the hurdle that a lot of your colleagues just can't get past?
It's certainly a hurdle. And I'll also just add that, we should look at the precedent that we've set in the past in terms of taking action. Back in the fall of 2020, when we saw reproductive rights were going to be under attack by decision makers in DC, we passed the Roe Act to protect women's rights in Massachusetts. This is a very similar calling, that if we are not able to protect voting rights of Americans in DC, we must take action and pass the Votes Act and protect voting rights of the people of Massachusetts. And I think that, that's something that, again, we cannot let for status quo dominate our decision making, that this is something about taking action. And that is something that people are expecting from us in this moment, in this time.
We have to leave it there. Erika Uyterhoeven and Cheryl Crawford, thank you both for making time to be part of this convo.